The Japanese sank the Wahoo in 1943 as it was leaving the strait between Russia and Japan. 8 decades of silence just came to an end in the freezing waters off the coast of Japan. Divers have finally confirmed the location of the legendary USS Wahoo. This was supposed to be a story of a sub blown to bits by a massive fleet. But here's where it gets tricky. The hull is sitting upright and looks almost perfect. To say it was a surprise is not even the half of it. We are going to look at why the history books might be totally wrong about how this ship went down. Hidden Secrets of the Wahoo. The USS Wahoo was a Gato-class submarine that was built at the Mare Island Navy Yard in California. It was over 311 ft long and wide enough to hold a crew of 80 men. When it was on the surface, it weighed over 1,500 tons. This was a massive machine made of steel and grit. At first, the sub did not have much luck. Its first commander was a bit too careful. But things changed fast when a man named Dudley Morton took over. Most people called him Mush. He was a bold leader who did not want to hide. He wanted to find the enemy and win. Under his lead, the Wahoo became famous for being very aggressive. It was the first sub to really take the fight to the enemy in shallow waters. Morton had a very simple rule. He wanted to sink every ship he saw. During its third patrol, the Wahoo did something amazing. It went into a harbor that was not well mapped and took out a huge transport ship. Then it turned around and sank more ships on the way home. By the time it finished its fourth patrol, it had taken out 9 ships in just 23 days. That was a record that almost no one could touch. The crew was proud, and the country loved them. They were like rock stars of the ocean. But here is where it gets tricky. The Wahoo was using torpedoes that did not always work. Back then, the American torpedoes were famous for being duds. They would hit a ship and just bounce off without exploding. Morton was so frustrated that he once said he could do better with a deck gun. Despite the bad equipment, the Wahoo kept winning. It was the top music scoring sub in the fleet for a long time. People believed that as long as Mush Morton was at the wheel, the ship was invincible. It seemed like they could go anywhere and do anything. They even went into the Sea of Japan, which was like walking into the enemy's living room. No one else was brave enough to do that at the time. The sub was fast, reaching over 20 knots on the surface. It was armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a big deck gun. The men who served on it knew they were part of history. They were a tight group of 80 sailors who trusted their captain with their lives. They had no idea that their 7th mission would be their last. That mission is where the logic starts to break down, and the mystery begins. The Wahoo left Hawaii in September of 1943. It stopped at Midway to fill up on fuel and then headed toward the cold waters near Japan. This area was very dangerous because the water was shallow and there were mines everywhere. Morton wanted to use a new kind of electric torpedo that did not leave a trail of bubbles in the water. This would make the sub a true ghost. For weeks, no one heard from them. Submarines usually stayed silent to avoid being found, so the Navy was not worried at first. But when the date for their return came and went, a heavy feeling started to settle over the base. The most famous ship in the fleet was missing. That is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the legend. Into the Sea of Japan. Let's switch gears for a second and look at what the Wahoo was doing in those final days. Based on records found after the war, we know the sub was very busy. On September 25th, it sank a freighter. A few days later, it took out a tanker. On October 5th, it hit a huge ship called the Conran Maru. This was a big deal because that ship was carrying very important people, including 2 members of the Japanese government. When that ship went down, the Japanese Navy was furious. They decided they were going to find whatever submarine was doing this and make sure it never went home. They sent out planes, sub-chasers, and boats with depth charges to hunt the Wahoo down. The area where the Wahoo was hunting was called the La Perouse Strait. It is a narrow body of water between 2 islands. To get out of the Sea of Japan and back to the open ocean, the sub had to go through this tiny gap. The Japanese knew this. They set up a trap. On the morning of October 11th, A shore battery at Cape Soya spotted a sub on the surface. They started shooting big guns, Clear's throat at it. The sub had to dive to stay safe, but once it was under the water, it was trapped in a small area. An airplane spotted an oil slick on the surface and dropped 3 bombs. This was the start of a 7-hour battle. According to the Japanese logs, they threw everything they had at the sub. They reported dropping 84 bombs from planes and 40 depth charges from ships. If you know anything about underwater explosions, you know that is a lot. Each one of those depth charges is like a massive hammer hitting a tin can. The logs say the water was churning with oil and pieces of wood. By the end of the day, they were sure the American sub was gone. They even saw a huge bubble of air and oil pop up at the end. The Japanese commanders went home thinking they had totally destroyed the Wahoo. But here is the part that nobody talks about. If a sub is hit by that many bombs in shallow water, it should be in thousands of pieces. The pressure from 84 bombs would tear the steel hull into scrap metal. For 80 years, that was the story everyone believed. Historians wrote books about the violent end of the Wahoo. They described a terrifying scene of fire and twisted metal. Families accepted that their loved ones were lost in a chaotic explosion. But the ocean holds on to its secrets very tightly, and it was not ready to give this one up yet. Fast forward a little bit, and things look totally different. Wreckage of the Ghost. To put it in simple words, finding a submarine in the ocean is like finding a needle in a hayfield. The La Perouse Strait is a big area with fast currents and very cold water. For decades, groups of people tried to find where the Wahoo went down. A group called the Wahoo Project was started in the 1990s. They used old records to try and narrow down the search. They even worked with Japanese historians to see exactly where the planes said they dropped their bombs. But the ocean is a messy place. Currents can move things miles away from where they sank. In 2005, a team of Russian divers using special sonar found something interesting. They saw a shape on their screen that looked like a long tube. It was sitting 185 ft deep. They sent down cameras to see what it was. When the images came back, the world was shocked. It was a Gatow-class submarine sitting perfectly upright on the sandy bottom. It was not in 1,000 pieces. It was not a pile of scrap metal. It was the USS Wahoo. This was the first time anyone had seen the ship since it vanished in 1943. When the divers got closer, they saw the number 238 on the side. That was the Wahoo's hull number. They also saw the deck gun and the specific tower shape that Morton had modified. There was no doubt about it. But as the cameras moved along the hull, the divers started to get confused. They expected to see massive holes and torn steel from the 84 bombs the Japanese music claimed to have dropped. Instead, the hull looked almost smooth. There were no giant gashes. There were no missing sections. Music. It looked like the sub had just sat down to take a nap. This is the part that makes absolutely no sense. Music. If the Japanese records were true, the sub should have been crushed, but the wreck showed only one major point of damage. There was a hole near the tower where a single bomb had hit. That one hit was enough to flood the ship and send it to the bottom. But what about the other 123 explosions? Where were the marks from the depth charges? Why was the ship still in one piece? It was like the battle the Japanese described and the ship on the ocean floor were two different things. Most folks have no idea that this discovery actually created more questions than it answered. Frozen in time. If you take away all the noise, it's about this one fact. The ship is too perfect. Experts who study shipwrecks say that depth charges are designed to crack the hull of a sub using water pressure. Even a near miss can bend the steel inward. If 40 depth charges were dropped on the Wahoo, it should look like a crushed soda can. But the footage from 2006 and newer video from 2024 shows a sub that is in great shape. The railings are still there. The guns are still in place. It is sitting upright as if it were still on patrol. This leads to a very strange theory. Some people think the Japanese might have been exaggerating how much they hit the sub. Or maybe the Wahoo was so tough that it handled the explosions better than anyone thought. But there is another possibility that is even more haunting. What if the sub wasn't actually sunk by the big battle? What if it survived the bombs and then sank later because of a small leak or a mechanical failure? The hole near the tower is real, but it doesn't explain why the rest of the ship is so clean. It defies the logic of wartime combat. Inside the ship, the situation is even more mysterious. Because the sub is a war grave, no one is allowed to go inside. It is the final resting place for 80 men, but we can guess what it looks like based on how the outside looks. Since the hull is intact, the inside is likely preserved. It is a time capsule from 1943. The coffee cups, the maps, and the personal items of the crew are all still there, sitting exactly where they were 80 years ago. It is a silent, dark world where time has stopped. The latest videos from the Russian team show that the ocean hasn't even grown much coral on the ship. The cold water has kept the steel from rusting away. It looks like a ghost ship. When people see the footage, they don't see a wreck. They see a sleeping giant. It makes you wonder what those 80 men were thinking in their final hours. Did they know they were becoming a legend? Did they try to fix the leak before the water took over? We may never know the full story of what happened inside those steel walls. That brings us right to the next big mystery. Plain and simple, the discovery of the USS Wahoo brought peace to many families. For 80 years, they had no place to go to honor their grandfathers and uncles. Now, there is a marker on a map. There are memorials at Cape Soya in Japan and at the Pearl Harbor subbase. Even though the condition of the ship is strange, the fact that it was found at all is a miracle. It reminds us of the risks those men took to go into enemy waters. They were pioneers of a new kind of war, and they paid the ultimate price. The Wahoo will stay where it is at the bottom of the strait. It is protected by international law and by the respect of two nations that were once enemies. Today, American and Japanese sailors both visit the site to drop wreaths in the water. The mystery of why the ship is so intact might never be fully solved. Maybe the Japanese pilots missed more than they thought. Maybe the mud on the bottom cushioned the ship. Or maybe the Wahoo was just a lucky ship even in its final moments. Does the perfect condition of the Wahoo mean the battle was smaller than we were told? Or was the ship just built to be indestructible? After 80 years of searching, are we still missing the biggest piece of the puzzle? Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep sea mysteries.